First, it is a pleasure to be here. As both the Dean, as Giannis and Paula mentioned, part of my history feels like I have come home. And I mean that it's both a compliment and a worry. The compliment is I am formed partly in the struggles by Slovenia, by colleagues of mine who were, I think, also my teachers about what the struggles were about in real places, not abstract places. So it feels correct to be here at the same time as it feels like some of the issues that we struggled with collectively and individually in education, in economic transformations, in political transformations remain. And I'm both pleased as a critical scholar to say, well, that's interesting, and also as a critical scholar to express some worries about a place that I hold in great respect and great fondness. So I want to be honest here. I want to talk not about Slovenia, because I am still learning. Slovenia is a noun, it is not a verb. It is in constant motion, and anything I would say probably tomorrow, when the Constitutional Court revotes on certain kinds of things, may need to be changed. So I'm going to talk about trends internationally, trends that are being seen throughout this region, but in other places as well. You can fill in when I talk about England or the United States or Australia or Germany or France. You can fill in Hungary or Poland or Austria, most recently Austria. And we can talk more honestly about that later on. At the end, I would hope that we have a robust discussion. I also want to say that unlike people in nations like Slovenia and many nations represented here, I am not bilingual. I am part of an imperial project. The United States assumes that the rest of the world will speak English. So I want to thank you very much for allowing me to speak English. I have some Espanol. I don't think that would be totally appropriate in Slovenia, though there may be people who speak Espanol here. But it is the case that even though I was born in very real impoverishment, and as some of you already know, I am first generation finishing secondary school in my family. But I was schooled, and I'm here because of teachers, and I want always to say that publicly. That actually gives me a great deal of respect for the people who formed me, but also means that I am also the product of an imperial project, and that project is ongoing throughout the world. We now call it neoliberalism, but it has a much longer history of enslavement, of murder, of removal of indigenous people. And because of that, again, I want to express my thanks to you for allowing me to embody the imperial project. I will speak to you in English. And I am always in amazement that those of you whose first language means that English is your fourth or fifth. Of course, I too have three languages: working class English, academic English, and an English that leads with fingers. All right. You'll forgive me, I will occasionally make jokes. My last name is indeed Apple. And because of, some of you know, I spent many years as a teacher in primary and secondary schools and was president of a teachers union. But my first 2 or 3 years, I was what is called a substitute teacher. I would call up the local Ministry of Education in the city where I was born, and they would tell me at 6 o'clock in the morning which schools I should prepare to go to. And if you go into a new classroom every day and tell your children that your last name is Mr. Apple, you better have a very juvenile sense of humor, otherwise you will not survive. But do not misinterpret my occasional attempt at humor. What I want to talk about is deadly serious. And it is now infecting as well as affecting the politics here, the school system here, and this entire region. All right? But again, you'll find that I occasionally will make jokes. And again, please do not misinterpret that. This is not funny. But my pedagogic style is formed as a primary school teacher. That is not to diminish your brilliance or perhaps my own. Okay? We'll see whether the latter part is true in a few minutes. I want us to engage with two concepts in the beginning. I ask simple questions. Whose knowledge is taught, whose knowledge isn't, why and why not? Who benefits from that? What is the relationship between education and larger social and ideological projects? Who wins and who loses? And I think these are structural as well as post-structural forms. And in order to understand them, we must ask particular kinds of questions and use particular kinds of concepts. And it requires that we understand that education has no independent existence worth talking about. That is, to understand education, we need two concepts. The first is what I call relational analysis, which says that education can only be understood by its connections to relations of dominance and subordination in the larger society, and to our conscious and sometimes unconscious struggles against those relations. Let me give a concrete example of that. When I was making the notes for my lecture here today, I did so in my office at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So I walked into my building, the teacher education building at the University of Wisconsin. I walked up the stairs. I opened my office door. I turned on the computer went on, and I began to type my lecture notes right here. We could say in a positivist form that is exactly what happened, yet it isn't what happened. Yes, Michael Apple walked into my building. I walked up the stairs. Yes, I opened my office door. Yes, I turned on the computer. But in my city, we burn coal to produce electricity. And in order for me to do politically committed educational scholarship, I now had an anonymous but an invisible but very real relationship with the 350 miners who must die or be badly injured in order for me to begin to type. So I want us to think about even my progressive work has to be understood, as all education must, by the relations in a real life. Okay, so the first step is that. The second concept is what I want to call repositioning. As a white male from the United States, I must see the world through the eyes, though it is very difficult, of women, of people who are gay, of people who are not benefiting from the international economy, many of whom also live in this nation called Slovenia. So I must understand the world in these two ways, repositioning and relationally. So that's the basis, and that is not simply a slogan. That is an epistemological position, that the best knowledge is done by engagement with relations. Okay? It is John Dewey in education with a little political bite to it, right? And the best knowledge must be understood as part of an epistemological war. Dominant groups do not wish to know what is happening, because then they must act. Right? So they will engage in what might be called an epistemological fog. Do not tell me what is really happening. And if you do, please do it through numbers only. I don't want to hear about the lives of real people. So these are epistemological issues as well as other kinds of issues, and they have implications for our research, for how we think about education, and what education is for. All right? So that's the basis for what I want to talk about. And I've been engaged in two projects. How do we understand whether it is possible for education to transform society, and who is doing it? That's the first project. The second project says, if I don't like the project that is now ongoing, how do I interrupt it? So it is a process both of intellectual work and political work. And I make no distinctions between the work at both of those levels. It seems to me that we are engaged whether we like it or not. We are in institutions that have interests already built into them. We can either accept those interests, we can compromise with those interests as often we must, and we can use Apple's third language, the language of that finger, to speak back. I would prefer to speak back. All right? So that's the end of the lecture. We're done. All right. In order to understand this, I want us to understand that we have always been engaged in a battle over bodies, a battle over knowledge, a battle over curriculum and pedagogy and evaluation. It comes in the form of PISA scores now or privatization, but it has always been there. There has never been this romantic time that education can be different from a politics. In order to understand that, I want to read from a teacher's diary, from an earlier book of mine, from a book called Official Knowledge. Now, I have this horrible habit of wanting to understand and listen to teachers' lives. I am still a teacher myself. This is what I do. But also I want to remember that this is grounded in the reality of schools. It is not simply a random economic and a random pedagogic issue. It is the history of education. So I want to read from a diary of a young woman who is 18 and a half years old. Her name is Emma. She's a young woman teacher who has gone to a normal school for 6 months and has been hired in the Boston public schools on the East Coast of the United States. And the principal has informed her that she will be evaluated after 3 months on the position to see whether she will have a permanent job. This is Emma's diary. I will not cross-dress. I will not raise my voice, but you must envision me now as a young woman called Emma. Okay? This will be interesting. Okay, so don't laugh at Apple, the vision of Apple cross-dressing. That's a different issue. Okay? All right. So, this is Emma. Dear God, the principal has informed me today that he will observe my classroom tomorrow. Dear God, I am so frightened. I know what he will do. He will choose one child to read. Oh my God, what if he chooses the wrong child? I am so frightened. End of diary before the observation. Second day. Emma again. Oh my God. I love this little phrase. Oh my God. The principal came in today and chose a child to read. I knew what I had to do. I knew I had to remind the child to say, page 35, chapter 4. I had to remind the child to hold the book in her right hand with the toes pointing at a perfect angle of 45 degrees, to remind the child to hold her head straight and high, to remind the child to have her eyes looking directly ahead, and to remind the child to lift up her voice and struggle in loud and unnatural tones. Dear God, I had remembered the position of the toes. I had remembered the right arm. I had remembered the nose. But I had forgotten to enforce the mentioning of page and chapter. The principal was quite angry. He slammed the door on the way out of my classroom. I fear my teaching career is at an end. I could end there because these people have returned in teacher education, in PISA scores, in the evaluation of what counts as good pedagogy, and we could all cry together. Emma was the founder of the first teachers' union in the United States, and in midnight +1 of her being also selected as the superintendent of exactly these schools, the first act she signed was to remove this way of evaluating teachers. That's a lesson I think we will need at the end, and I will return to Emma's lesson to us at the end. All right? But I want us to remember nothing we are facing is totally new. So I want us to look at the world through Emma's eyes for a little while and understand the politics of the body. Foucault is not stupid about this at all. And the politics of disciplining working class children. It was a poor school. And oddly enough, illegally, this was an interracial school, one of the first in the cities of the United States. Since remember, we were South Africa. And oddly enough, we still are, even though it's against the law. I will try and offend everyone at least once. Would you let me know if I haven't? I'm very good at it. So, okay. All right, so clearly this is a way of disciplining knowledge, bodies, etc. And it has not stopped. I want now to talk about a current situation. Again, I will not talk about Slovenia, though occasionally I will give examples from it. It would be an act of imperialism if I did, and the U.S. is imperial enough for me to not perform imperial projects in public. So, these people are back, and they have usually been criticized. And they also have a pedagogic project. That pedagogic project is to change what counts as a good school, what counts as a good student, a good curriculum, a good citizen, and who is appropriate, who is a good, if you will, who has good knowledge. And whether we like it or not, they have changed fundamentally the ways we evaluate our institutions and the categories that we use. So as we know, there's a particular kind of form that is now worldwide, what we call neoliberalism. I want to make an argument because I think that this is exactly wrong. It is not only neoliberalism. It never has been. It never will. There is what Gramsci would call a new hegemonic bloc. There are 4 groups, actually, in most nations who are pushing education in powerful ways. One of them is increasingly current here, and that is neoliberalism. Private is good and public is bad. But if you think it is only neoliberalism, you will never win. Neoliberalism is very powerful, but never stands alone. So I need to say some things about neoliberalism as part of what Gramsci would call a new hegemonic bloc, an alliance of people in dominance, some of whom, by the way, will vote for the left as well as the right, and that makes it even more difficult to interrupt. So, I want to say a few things about the politics of this. As Gramsci reminds us, dominant groups have 2 choices. They can engage in what might be called a war of maneuver, or what he calls a war of position. And he makes a distinction between this. And he says a war of maneuver is like World War I, where 2 armies line up, and Paolo has an army here, and they have guns, and Michael has an army here, and we have guns, and Paolo and Michael yell charge, and whoever is left alive wins. But rightist mobilizations, including neoliberals, have discovered a different kind of war. As Gramsci reminds us, it is a battle over common sense. A war of position says that everything counts. Do not privilege only the economy, privilege everything. And the task is a battle over everything simultaneously. And the task is to connect these battles so that they're part of a larger project, which means that pedagogy, curriculum, testing, evaluation, the word in English is always accountability. I will come back to that because it actually is a progressive as well as retrogressive word. So all of this becomes part of a larger pedagogic project. And whether we like it or not, and I assume many people here do not, the right has engaged in a vast social and pedagogic project to push education and all things social in particular directions. And they have said, remarkably, that they will engage in sort of a Paulo Freire-like process of listening carefully to people's complaints and to push education in powerful ways. And in fact, I will want to claim, and will claim publicly right now, that the only good Gramscians left in the world are not on the left, they're on the right. The right understands what Gramsci reminded us, that the struggle for consciousness, the struggle for common sense is central to any transformation, and that means that education is central to any social mobilization and any social project. So unlike many people on the left who assume automatically that you must win in the economy before you win anything else, therefore schools and teachers can do nothing, I would prefer we listen to our enemies. The right is saying profoundly, education is a site in which mobilizations are absolutely central to any social transformation. They must know something we don't. And in fact, I want to respect the people I disagree with, and we'll come back to that in a second, because they do believe that education is fundamental. And it does point to the fact they wouldn't care about education at all if there hadn't been victories. So we must be doing something right if they are attacking us constantly. All right? Okay. So I want to use the metaphor of an umbrella. Gramsci reminds us one simple thing. When I say Gramsci 17 times, the lecture is over. Okay? I think I'm at 4 now. So when I hit 15, remind me what I said. Okay? Because then it's getting either close or I'm lying. Okay? So the G person, I just saved one. The G person reminded us that it is a useless concept to talk about concepts such as false consciousness. No one has false consciousness. People have what are called contradictory understandings of their daily life. There are elements of good sense and bad sense in tension. And the role of the right is to reach in and listen very, very carefully to real people's complaints, because people are not stupid about their daily lives. They do understand what is happening to them. And the task of dominant groups is to take dominant ideological forms and connect to people's real understandings, not their false understandings. So here is the process that goes on. It is reigning in education. Everyone believes it is reigning in education. For capital, it is reigning in education. And I quote now from a hedge fund manager, education is like a black hole in physics. We pour huge amounts of money in, and PISA scores do not come out. It is a waste of money. For parents in Slovenia, the United States, Chile, Argentina, Austria, England, France, Germany, everywhere, it is reigning in education because the neoliberalization of the economy is such that no one has permanent jobs. You have no careers, you have temporary jobs. You must be an entrepreneur. You must make a business of yourself. Hence, the government of Slovenia reminding us that what should be taught is entrepreneurial skills, to make a business of yourself, to constantly show that you are doing the right thing. Okay. So it is reigning for parents. It is reigning for teachers constantly. So in the United States, as an example, 500,000 teachers have been fired in the last 3 years. It is truly reigning in education, and because of the dominance of what we call performance pay for teachers in the United States right now, teachers are paid by the results of their students on test scores. So it is reigning in education. And since we only test 2 subjects, basic literacy skills and mathematics, because those are the more important ones on PISA, right? It is reigning in education because if you don't get high test scores, your salary will not increase. So it is reigning. For minoritized groups and immigrant groups, those that have not been killed by the government of Syria, I'll just let that stand for a second. Okay? And we'll talk about Hungary later. Okay? Given that, I told you I would try and offend everyone at least once. Okay? I assume that many people in this audience are not offended by what I just said. For these people, it is reigning in education, first because there are no schools for their children. And secondly, when they get to Sweden or to Norway, they are told they cannot really be smart. There is something genetically inferior about them. And their parents obviously are less literate and don't care. So it is reigning for everyone in education. And dominant groups' role, creatively, pedagogically, is to reach in and connect to that understanding. That is a creative, pedagogic process. So there are now attempts consciously now to use education powerfully to get people out of the rain. So dominant groups engage in what might be called the process of beckoning. They must engage in a creative pedagogic process of saying, it is raining in education, I must convince you to come under my umbrella. Rather, not Michael Apple's umbrella, not Paolo's umbrella, not the dean's umbrella, and not your umbrella in many ways. I must come under the umbrella of dominant groups. That is a creative process, and that requires powerfully that I take words that have a strong emotional economy, that when we hear them, we applaud. Words like democracy, freedom, citizenship must be transformed. I'll come back to that in a second. Now, in order to do this, we have to have many hands on that umbrella. So there are 4 groups that are in charge of dominance with Gramsci. That's number 6, I think. I think it's 5. I just said G once before. There are 4 groups under this umbrella, okay, with their hands on it. The first is what we call neoliberals. They believe that, very clearly that private is good and public is bad. Supposedly they believe in a weak state. That is a fiction. There has never been a weak state under neoliberalism, something I will argue in a minute. But they believe very, very strongly that by making schools, teachers, and others compete, to place them on a market, to have government funding for 100% of private schooling, right? But this, and the more we can have these schools be transformed under the leadership of privatizing initiatives, the more competitive they will be. Good schools will close, that was Freud working through me. Before anyone read Nietzsche, there was Freud. Right? And Freud has now worked through me, and I must leave in embarrassment now. Okay. So back to good schools and bad schools. Bad schools will close, good schools will open, stay open. By the way, there is no empirical evidence in the world to support this claim. We do know one thing about those nations that have marketized. It increases inequality. Okay? At best, marketization and privatization inequalities remain the same, but there are other negative consequences. But as I show in in a book called Educating the Right Way, with right being ironic, there is no evidence. So neoliberals want evidence-based practices, but don't give me evidence, because there is no confirmation of these claims. Okay. So neoliberals want this weak state, supposedly, and a vision, if you will, of competitive forms, and they will change our understandings. And I'll come back to that in a second. There is a second group that believes in a strong state, and they always accompany neoliberals. This is what we call technically neoconservatives. They have a cultural project, the restoration of a common culture. It is what Pierre Bourdieu calls an act of symbolic violence. In no nation of the world has there ever been a common culture. There are cultures that are compromises. Culture is not a noun, it is also a verb. It is in constant motion. Witness Slovenia, which has some things that are common, new populations that are arising, coming from all over the world. Right? This city is in motion. And we must recognize that. So this vision of a strong state with a cultural agenda is, in fact, again, something that I will call in a minute an act of symbolic violence. Okay? I'll come back. I'm promising to come back. I probably won't, but okay. There is a third group that is less powerful here, but is now emerging again, and it is what I want to call, following Stuart Hall, authoritarian populism. This is a group that says the people must decide, but there are good people and bad people. These are often religious conservatives who believe that everything can be solved if we empower religious understandings of the world. I want to be very cautious about this. I work in Turkey with Muslim women activists who say the Quran as a holy book is anti-capitalist. That surprised me too. But I want to say, I'm not asking about whether you are quoting from the holy book correctly. I'm going to look at your actions. I work with liberation theologists in Brazil who say, I quote now, Jesus was the first socialist. I am not going to criticize that. I may not be deeply religious myself in the usual senses of that term, but I think actually the left has pushed people under the umbrella of neoliberals and religious conservatives by not understanding that for some people, democratic form comes from deep religious commitments. I think we have made horrible mistakes about that. Do not misinterpret me about that. I will still say that the Hindutva movement in India which sees Islam as the great invader, even though it's been there for 1,300 years, that the way the Palestinians are treated by Israel is simply an act of war crime. Okay? So, and I will work with Palestinian activists on that, who believe very strongly, for religious reasons, that we must fight against the oppression in education and elsewhere that is going on by the Israeli government. And someone who is myself of Jewish heritage, it makes it even more powerful for me. Okay? But this is a group that believes that once we have God restored, everything will be fine. You cannot understand Pakistan or India or El Salvador or Guatemala with its death squads, as an example. These are strong evangelical forces that are cleansing societies of the polluting other. Okay? It should not surprise anyone, though it may, that the fastest growing school reform in my own nation is not privatization, it is not marketization, it is homeschooling. 3 to 5 million children have been pulled out of public and religious schools for religious reasons and are being schooled at home because even church schools are not conservative enough. This makes Opus Dei look like it doesn't exist. Okay? So this becomes extraordinarily powerful, and I quote, capitalism is God's economy. Okay? So we have to understand that behind neoliberalism are other forces that become crucial. There's a fourth group that I want to call a particular fraction of the professional and managerial new middle class. This is a group that will always vote for Obama, will never vote for Cameron, will never vote for right-wing parties in Austria or Slovenia or Germany who think Angela Merkel needs to be thrown away. Right? But it is their cultural capital that is also part of educational policy. These are people who believe one simple thing: if it moves in classrooms, measure it. And if it hasn't moved yet, measure it anyway in case it moves tomorrow. So they have a particular expertise, often from universities and faculties of education and management, and they have carved out a sphere of autonomy for their own employment within the state. And I want, behind this is actually a different form of class analysis. I think the two-class models are much too mechanistic. So this is the sociologist coming out that says the following: why should we assume that classes in dominance in the educational apparatus are always exactly the same as classes in dominance within the economic apparatus? That is not necessarily the case. And a good deal of educational policy is the cultural capital of a particular fraction, the managerial fraction of the new middle class. So it is perfectly possible for us to win battles against neoliberalism and still lose in education. And that's fundamentally important for any social transformation in education. Okay? Dominant groups, for instance, often do not want only PISA scores. Right? Some of them will say, that is too much regulation. It is often the new middle class that sees this. It is part of the mobility strategies that they hold as part of their own children's mobilizations. Okay? All right, so these four groups are in charge. And this makes it complicated, because if we say it is only the right, we will lose. Do you understand that? Okay? That's very important. So we could still elect an Obama in the United States, where my wife, the other professor, I have to be careful, it's not the other Professor Apple, Rima, who's in the back of the room. Sometimes I'm the other Professor Apple. But we were in tears when Obama won. And then he put in place all of this. Performance pay for teachers did not come under the right. It did not come under Bush. It came under Obama. There's a lesson to be learned here about how you think about interruption. Let me talk a bit about neoliberalism. I mentioned the neoliberals have a vision of a weak state, supposedly, that economic rationality must eat other forms of rationality. It is Habermas squared. Right? And in many ways, this is not a neutral agenda. It's an agenda of what might be called an efficiently acquisitive class. And in many ways, its task is to change our identities and to change the way we think about schools, curriculum, teaching, etc. And in order to accomplish this, it must take words that have an emotional economy, words that when we hear them, we get this wash of warmth over us that says, I like that. And the key word here is the word democracy. So if we were to have a democratic discussion about what counts as democracy in education, we would have a conversation usually that teachers are treated with respect. The government is not simply imposing everything on schools, that communities also have a voice, that students are not treated only as future workers, right? There would be what we call in philosophy a vision of thick democracy. And the task of dominant groups is to engage in what Stuart Hall calls a process of disarticulation and rearticulation. Take the words that have emotional meaning that we use to validate our institutions, words like democracy, and transform their very meanings. So, as my friends in sociolinguistics remind us, concepts have no essential meanings. They're sliding signifiers. This bottle, I'm hoping that it's Schlibowitz, but I fear it's water. That's a private joke that Paolo will understand. This bottle of water is democracy. And the task of dominant groups is to pour out these meanings and pour in new ones, while keeping the word in circulation and resting on its emotional valorance. Okay? So, we'll see if I get wet. Okay. This is my Foucaultian moment. I have the water, you do not. It's so good. All right. So the task of dominant groups is to pour out this water while keeping the word in circulation, and then to change its very meanings. All right? So it will take a word like democracy, and it must literally engage in a vast pedagogic project in which democracy is no longer thick but thin. Democracy is no longer fully participatory, no longer about a politics of voice. It is now consumer choice. So the world must be made into a vast supermarket in which choice now guarantees a new definition of freedom and a definition of democracy. Now, I love the word supermarket because in the real world, in many ways, the world is like a supermarket. There are some people who can go into the largest supermarket in Ljubljana and buy any damn thing they wish. And there are many, many people who can walk outside the supermarket and look in the window, and they do not have the economic capital that neoliberalism promises, and they can eat the image of the product. It's a perfect metaphor for what we might call postmodern consumption. So that is the real world of choice. And as I mentioned, through vouchers, choice plans, what we do know are the following. Racialized apartheid systems become worse, class divisions become worse, and those people in almost every nation who already have economic, cultural, and social capital employ the market to take their child away from the polluting body and culture of the other. It becomes the gated community of the schools. Right? So that's the empirical confirmation of these kinds of things. Now, it also has a process of, as I mentioned, changing our identities. So what it does in many ways is the following. It declasses, deraces, degenders people. Do not think of yourself as part of a long history of fighting against oppressive social relations. Do not think of yourself as a union member. Do not think of yourself as someone who acts with immigrants to demand their rights. Now think of yourself as a profit-maximizing, possessive individual. So this becomes a crucial thing, not just ideologically, but in terms of people's identities. And in fact, then, what it ultimately does is export the blame for the crisis onto consumer choice. So if Michael, as a poor person, where my parents were, made a bad choice, it is not the government's responsibility. It must be that Michael made a bad choice. So it actually is a strong process of exporting the blame onto the people that it actually increases the inequality for. I mentioned that this is a process of a weak state, and I also mentioned that that is exactly wrong. Here's the fundamental concept in economics. It's called a zero-sum game. This is the budget of Slovenia. It's the budget of the United States. Okay? This is all the money that's supposedly there. All right? So, the vision of a weak state says, we will take money from welfare, education, etc., and give it to the private sector, and we'll have some form of accountability that they will not misspend it. That's the vision. That's the neoliberal agenda. In my state, the state of Wisconsin, here's the budget. There is more money spent on prisons than on higher education combined. That doesn't sound like a weak state. 1 out of every 4 African-American young men is now in jail or has been in jail. That's a vast tax redistribution process in which what used to be spent on education, welfare, and health care slides over to the injustice system. So we are perfectly willing in my state to give free housing, free education, free food, as long as you're willing to be placed in prison. That is not a weak state at all. The prisons are then privatized, so you have working class white men and women who have lost their jobs when factories moved to China, being employed as the guards of the prisons of working class young men and women of color. That is not a weak state. There's an expansion of the repressive state. This is what I mean about empirically we need to speak back. All right? Am I clear about that? So every time you hear we must deregulate and weaken the state, you must ask, could I see the prison budget, please? Okay? Immediately, just ask. All right, okay. Second, neoliberalism cannot exist without neoconservatism. There is no neoliberalism without it. For schools to be placed on a market, you must have information about what counts as a good school and what counts as a bad school. Okay? Because it's consumption practices. That means that testing becomes even more important. So the argument that neoliberals make is, once you set the market loose, parents can choose whatever school they want. An art school, a flight simulator school, an engineering emphasis school. Parental choice will lead to this vast community of different schools. Yet if Michael is teaching something different than Paula, they're not comparable. So oddly enough, markets need a centralized curriculum without talking about centralization, and that is guaranteed by tests. So PISA is essential for marketization. So every time you hear we need a national curriculum to keep the market out, oddly enough, in many nations, the first step towards privatization is nationalization. Now, whether that's the case here is for you to determine. But we have to understand what is going on nationally. So it means more testing more often, and it means statistically what we call a regression towards the mean. That schools basically teach the same things so that Michael can compete against Paula. But if we're doing different things, there can be no competition. I don't know what is a good school or a bad school. And since parents are also told now that democracy is choice, they will look at one thing: test scores. All right? So oddly enough, this becomes even more powerful. It also has what I call the form of symbolic violence. It is someone's vision of what counts as the common. As I mentioned before, and it's a phrase I will use constantly, words like the common culture must be not nouns, but always verbs. They cannot be imposed. What counts as the common is one question: what is common? And unless that is constantly asked, there can be no common. I'll give one example from the new National History Test curriculum in the United States, which sounds so liberal. We are told in our new national history standards something that sounds very progressive. We are all immigrants. People from Slovenia, people from Nigeria, people from Papua New Guinea, people from China, people from España, everyone is an immigrant. That sounds so refreshing. Okay. So it was United States history. The U.S. government for 70 consecutive years gave smallpox-infected blankets to indigenous people. 3 million indigenous people died. That doesn't sound like immigration to me. That sounds like murder. In order for the United States to have an economy, it had to enslave people. There is no such thing as a slave. Someone must do it to someone else. Enslavement is a verb as well as a noun. In the ships coming over from Africa to the United States and to Latin America, to the Caribbean, 3 to 5 million black individuals died. It was a Holocaust. That does not sound like immigration to me. That sounds like mass murder. Whose is the common? Now, I don't have the right to answer that. What is common is the democratic and critical deliberation that has all voices heard about what counts as the common. Slovenia is in motion. The United States is in motion. Slovenia is a vast experiment. And the question is, an experiment in what? It is in motion. Thank goodness. The question is, whose voices will be heard about what counts as Slovenia? What counts as my nation as well? This is why I want to use the terms, if you will, of Pierre Bourdieu, problematic though he was, brilliant though he was, and a friend, that this is an act of symbolic violence. It misconstrues the nature of the process by which common must be determined. Authoritarian populists I will turn to now. And this, as I mentioned, is a group that believes that the people must decide. I mentioned that homeschooling becomes the fastest growing school reform. It is growing massively in Germany, as you may know. It's growing massively in England. 80% of the people pulling their children out of schools are doing so for ultra-conservative religious reasons. Okay? I want to read a letter that is now circulating throughout the United States. It's gone to every school to give you a sense of what they wish to have taught. I am the parent of such and such of a child in your school. I hereby request that my child be involved in no school activities or materials such as the following. If you do, I will get a lawyer. Okay? Here is what you cannot do. There must be no discussion of values, no discussion of morals, no discussion of religion or moral standards, no open-ended discussions of any kind. I love that. No discussions of death, abortion, euthanasia, suicide, violence. No curricula pertaining to alcohol or drugs. No instruction in nuclear war, which I did all the time. Children, here's a formula for a nuclear weapon. Right? No discussions of one world government, no discussions of globalization, no education about human sexuality, including premarital sex, contraception, abortion, homosexuality, masturbation, prostitution, divorce, population control, the roles of males and females, no uses of pornography. It goes on. No discussions of evolution. No discussions of witchcraft, the occult, or other forms of Eastern religions, Islam. Okay? No critical appraisals of any institutions. No critical appraisals of lawyers, physicians, or government ministers. No discussion of income. No autobiographical assignments. And it goes on. I am left with one question. What is left to teach? Okay? Now, we can laugh about this. The fastest growing school reform. If we push religious activists away, that space is filled. So neoliberalism creates identities in which choice becomes important. Once we lose collective sensibilities, that space gets filled by other collectivities. And this is one of the collectivities that becomes crucial. All right? So I don't want to minimize this. This is serious business. And many of the conflicts within this region around religious understandings are now mobilizing exactly these kinds of ideological resources to close borders, knowing that you are condemning children to death. Finally, there is the new middle class. Everything must be measurable. It's what Habermas would call purposive rational action patterns, destroying the Lebenswelt. And in many ways, this also has major transformations in teaching and in curriculum. Teachers then must be held accountable, their feet to the fire of competition. Teacher education must be privatized and marketized. So the fastest growing school reform for faculties of education throughout the world are things like Teach for America, Teach First in England, Teach for Chile, Teach China, Teach Korea, Teach Argentina. Okay? Meaning, why do we need faculties of education? Why should education be a university function overall? So in Japan right now, the leader of the nation, Abe, has said we must close faculties of education because after all, the private sector will do a much better job. Anyone can teach. It can be done in 6 weeks in the summer, and you can place people in any classroom. It is incredibly disrespectful. So these are the kinds of things that are going on. There's the deskilling of teaching in powerful ways. Now this reminds me powerfully of what is happening in many ways to many teachers. It's what we used to call the proletarianization of labor, the deskilling of teachers. So think about this. If the curricula is always predetermined, if the common has no teacher's voice, teachers make 10,000 decisions every day. Intellectual decisions, the emotional labor of teaching is unbelievably intense. In fact, the best description of teaching I have ever heard in my life is by a friend of mine who teaches at a secondary school. And we were talking outside, and I said, Gregory, how was today? And he said, it was a day like every day. I didn't have time to go to the toilet. It's the best description of being a dean, of being a faculty member, of being a teacher, a social worker, a nurse, a parent. It is the best description I've ever heard. Now that requires immense emotional labor, immense skill to deal with the fact that as neoliberalism shrinks social responsibility for health care, for communities, for dealing with the elderly, someone must deal with it. And it is the unpaid labor of women in communities. And it is teachers who now must become nurses, social workers, counselors, parents, constantly. That is the new agenda. Now, think about the requirements of the skills of being a teacher. If you broke your leg playing football, you're on the national Slovenian women's team, which is pretty good, actually, right? And you broke your leg, and I said to you, I'm going to put you back in once the cast is removed. It would take you probably like a year to get good again. So we are now asking teachers to do everything, and at the same time telling them that we will disrespect all of their skills, and they are no longer required, by the way. So the Ministry of Education in the United States and in England is not in a government building at all. It's called Pearson and Company. It is the largest commercial publisher in the world of educational materials. And when schools no longer have the money to buy the curriculum, it means that teachers will have to build it themselves. But for the next 5 years, they will not be called upon to build anything. It will be provided for them commercially. They will have lost the skills. So all of this is a formula for the destruction of the professionalization of teachers. This alliance has permanent effects in powerful ways. So let me close with some ideas about how we interrupt this. We could end now with my returning to Emma and say, guess what? They're back, and it's much worse than we anticipated. As I point to in my latest book, which is on sale for 4 times the price outside, that's not a joke. No. In Can Education Change Society? By the way, not a joke. Rima and I get no royalties from our books or from lectures. They go to social mobilizations and movements. I get a salary. The government does not tax me for what I believe. So any extra money goes to those things that we believe in. So the money goes, for instance, to the battered women's shelter around the corner from our house. Okay? So if I mention a book, it's not so I can drive a Mercedes, for many reasons. Okay? Actually, I do want... No, never mind. Okay. I'm a working-class masculine person. Big engines are very important to me. Not really. Okay. So, as I say in the latest book, there are places throughout the world that are interrupting this now. One of my favorite places, and a third of the book is on this, is Porto Alegre in Brazil, where any decision over budgets by anyone in the state must also be made by anyone who can be affected by it. I'll give one example. The sports ministry of the city of Porto Alegre has $100,000 to build a new football field. It already knows that that football field, that empty space, that students and youth are killing each other over by gangs. It is about to build a new juvenile prison as of 3 years ago for those youth in gangs. They decided they could not build another prison. What they did was the following. They said to the gangs, we're about to make a decision on a football field. You do it. You make the decision. A remarkable thing happened. There's no killings. There's no need for the juvenile prison. And the gangs actually, by being treated with respect and honestly, made the correct decision. It would be shared. I'm not a romantic about that. Poverty, having grown up poor myself, I do not romanticize what poverty does to people. Okay? But in schools, the community helps vote on the budget. Teachers are paid an extra month's salary to go work in the community to find out what is important knowledge for the youth there and bring it back. There are models all over the world of doing this. The Democratic Schools book that Jim Bean and I put together is another example. Most teachers are horrified by neoliberal reforms. But they don't know for many of them, they will shut their door and do interesting things, we hope. But at the same time, those things die when the door is closed. They're not communicated. That says something about the role of institutions such as the University of Ljubljana. Part of the task of critical scholarship is to act as the secretary of those teachers and administrators in real schools throughout this nation and every other nation who are challenging neoliberal reforms and neoconservative reforms. We must act as their secretaries. As post-structural critics have reminded us, the subaltern always speak. The question is anyone listening? And part of our task is to challenge this vision of what science looks like at this university and every other. Sometimes narratives of struggle that are successful need to be legitimated as science. So part of our task here in buildings like this is to continue the epistemological battle that says real life must be brought in. We must, in fact, act as the critical secretaries of those people who document with their lives that it is possible to do something different. All right? Finally, my last words. There is one resource that must be kept alive, but never in romantic ways, and that is the notion of hope. Here's the diary. It was horrible. It was truly horrible. So there was a time in teachers' lives in my own nation, the bastion of democracy, where teachers were evaluated by whether a student had her toes pointed at a perfect angle of 45 degrees, where the child had to point her nose directly ahead, where you had to always say page 35, chapter 4. It would have been very easy for Emma to say, I'm leaving. I can't do this anymore. It is totally disrespectful. She mobilized. She founded the first union. She was a socialist. That's interesting to me. This is Slovenia. I cannot tell you what to do, but this place has a rich history. We must recapture that history, but we also must recapture that real teachers now, in this great nation, are doing some things that the right does not like. If that doesn't give us hope, nothing will. Thank you.
May I make a comment?
Please.
You promised us to quote Gramsci 17 times. You did quote only 9 times, if I am correct. But you did mention a word which is quite important in some of your books, in some of your papers: autonomy of teacher. What does autonomy of teacher, what could autonomy of teacher mean in these dark, rainy, thunderstorm days as today?
I need to say some things that are both practical and theoretical in order to deal with this. So there is a larger concept from Althusser called relative autonomy, that whatever autonomy is possible is always relative. That is, it is changeable. It is within a particular context, often for Althusser, economic. But we have to ask, autonomous from what? Okay? So it is perfectly possible, for instance, for teachers to have autonomy based on a vision of professionalism, but the very nature of professionalism is being challenged and transformed. That's actually one of the concepts that neoliberalism is challenging. So let me give an example of this. It is perfectly possible for teachers to resist powerfully particular kinds of forms of state intervention or privatized intervention around issues of gender. There's a very, very long history in the United States of feminist teacher mobilizations and teachers saying, we will be treated as professionals. That's what's called in philosophy liberal discourse. We have the ability as rational human beings, and liberalism is based on this vision of contracts and rationality, that we have this, that we have the right to be treated as individuals because we have rationality. So we have human rights, those are based on rational forms, okay? And to use that as a way of winning autonomy from control, like of that principle. So if we went into Emma's diary, we would see Emma saying, I must be treated with respect. Okay? And in part, it's a feminist claim. All right. Now, we have, as I mentioned, in the United States and many nations, new populations coming who are demanding what Nancy Fraser would call a politics not just of redistribution, but a politics of recognition, a demand for respect and voice. And that is challenging the traditional definitions of professionalism. So, in Chicago or New York or in my city, Madison, there's a much larger group of people from Mexico and a much larger group of quite militant now, and deservedly so, African Americans who are saying, the word in the United States is there's a school to prison pipeline. So children come in loving school, and by the 3rd grade, for children of color, they hate school. And by the time they are 13 or 14, they've been arrested. And we have metal detectors getting into schools. And children, by the way, now, it's what we call an anti-violence policy. There's they're called no excuses policies. Children at the age of 5 who bring in like a pocket knife, kindergarten children, will be put in handcuffs and arrested. There are police officers in many of our schools, okay? Now, given that, what is happening is many, many oppressed parents are saying, we don't trust the teachers. We must be treated in ways that we don't have to teach these children. And we, in many ways, will be treated as professionals. So your demand that you have a voice from oppressed communities challenges our autonomy. And black and brown parents are saying, your autonomy gives me no space to interrupt. Your definition of professionalism, which is based on autonomy, respect, professional knowledge, says that I have false consciousness, that I don't understand what's good for my child. And my child is winding up in a youth gang and then in prison. So either you change your definition of professionalism and autonomy, or we will shut your school down. Okay? Now, so this becomes an example. Autonomous from what? I want to defend teachers' professionalism powerfully. I'm the former president of a teachers' union. So I will go to the death defending teachers' rights. If and only if they also respond to insurgent voices from below. And if they do not, that is traditional unionism. It is not what I call social justice unionism, which now must say in societies riven, being destroyed by neoliberal agendas. It means that your definition of professionalism contradicts other people who are subaltern, and you must find a way of defending your gains, your autonomy, and at the same time defending the right of the most oppressed groups. When the empire has now come home in the United States, you must defend their rights at the same time. I don't know the answer to this. We are in struggle about that. How can I simultaneously defend this idea of teachers maintaining respect and the autonomy of practices, so the state is not doing what that principle did, but knowing that paradoxically, that defense can lead in many ways to the dismantling or disrespect of social mobilizations by the most oppressed people in my own nation. Okay? So that is the question to me that that I'm trying to solve in the new book. So I want to find the things, for instance, what I call decentered unities. What are the things that can be shared rather than having teachers so angry in many places that these insurgent voices are challenging their professionalism? I want to say, what are the things that bind us together? Can we work together? And in Chicago, there was just a recent teachers' strike that went on for 60 days, in which the entire black community walked on picket lines with the teachers who were on strike. And many black and brown grandmothers went on a hunger strike against the local Ministry of Education, which was fundamentally neoliberal, which was closing down schools, giving the money to hedge fund managers, to privatize schools. Okay? So I want to, this is where I become an empiricist in some ways. And when I meant about sort of being critical secretaries, I want research that shows how that is possible. How can you defend traditional definitions of autonomy with new, more social justice-oriented ones that include different voices? Okay?
On your final words, you said that there should be a notion of hope. What can we really hope for? What's really the near future realities of teaching, including teachers' life?
Okay. This is a crucial question and it actually is a crucial question theoretically as well. First of all, those of us who have a long history of doing critical work in universities, often what used to be called, and still I think usefully can be called the left, but what that means now is quite complicated, very complicated right now. It is not second international Marxism. That's not my position. Okay? It's not economism. We are being challenged. Well, the most dangerous word in the English language is the word we. Okay? It's a very dangerous word. Okay?
It's also its
So we are being challenged by people who say utopian dreams are useless. They're power-knowledge relations. It's Foucault meets Derrida meets a whole array of people. They're very smart and epistemologically very naive, because for them the world is made up of a bunch of stories. I don't think poverty is a story. We make discourses about it, but it has a real material existence. But they are challenging the very idea of utopian dreams. I think that is a mistake. I think that utopian dreams can be deeply dangerous, but without a vision that is a dream of what is possible, I don't know what we're struggling for. That leads to simple reformism, but they also deconstruct reformism. They say, look, everything is a power-knowledge couplet. That's an overstatement. Okay? The world is contradictory. Right? I'm not a theorist of reproduction. I'm a theorist of contradiction. Things are yeses and nos at one and the same time. But I do want to say that we do need to not just return, but a partial return to particular kinds of visions that say, this is what the world should look like, and I will work towards that. And we have lost the collective memory of those dreams. Now, those dreams need to be countered by other people's dreams as well. That's why I wanted to start out by saying the word we is really dangerous. It's my point about a common culture. There is no common dream that is to be built. So the hope must be collectively arrived at. And it's why the concept I want to use that is what I call, again, decentered unities. We must find the spaces where people can criticize each other, where those dreams are built. But if we let them remain as dreams, we will fail. So there's a concept that I love from André Gortz called non-reformist reforms, which says this. There's a million things we have to do in schools right now. A million. We can't do all of them. It's impossible. First of all, they won't allow us to do it, and there's never enough money to do them anyway. Okay? So we have to choose. You choose those things that are reforms, that open the spaces for further politicization, that get you closer to those collective dreams. Right? So my answer to this is partly a process answer. That is, the dreams are to be built, but they also are there in memory. And at the same time, we must still solve real problems. When teachers, for instance, or future teachers say to me, I'm really scared about answering a question, what do I do on Monday? I will never say that's a stupid question. I have too many memories that I had to solve the question of what do I do on Monday. The question is now, how do I use that to pry open a further political understanding of who has power, of what has to go on, where the curriculum should come from, all right? So it seems to me that, again, part of this is how do we restore some of these dreams, but who is the we in the first place, and whose dream was it in the first place? But we still have to act. And it's one of the reasons I started off by saying this is part of an epistemological war. You'll forgive the military metaphors, especially here, those are dangerous. Okay, this entire region, to talk about war is a very dangerous position to take. But at the same time, we have to begin to credit the fact, powerfully, that these things, again, need not a reduction of the space of what counts as knowledge, but an expansion of it so that the lives of real people now can be credited with insight. So that's again why I want to say this is a we that is to be in formation. But it also means, as an example, that we must learn from people who are making the interruptions. So if we want to know what the dream is, we look at real people doing it. So there's a chapter in here of one of my favorite schools, a school called Fratney Street School in Milwaukee. It's a public school, gets no private funds. Okay? It is a two-way bilingual school. Half the children speak Espanol, speak Spanish, and the other half speak English. And for every half year, the students who are Spanish speakers are in that school, they fall behind another half year because there's only one language spoken, and that's English. Right? So they decided that all teachers would make a commitment to learn Espanol, and for 1 month, every subject is taught in Spanish to every child, and for the next month, every student is spoken to in English. At the end of 3 years, every child was bilingual, and they used good neoliberal arguments. It's really clever. They stole back neoliberalism from neoliberals and said, will your children have better income and better jobs if they speak 2 languages? The answer is, of course. Right? But they used that to pry open the fact that in this city, Milwaukee, which was the heavy industrial city in the Midwest, made parts for automobiles, and all those factories have gone. So oppressed groups are fighting against each other. Black groups are fighting Latino, Spanish-speaking groups, and are fighting English-speaking groups, all working class and poor. And instead, you had meetings in which parents talked to each other, and now they have formed an alliance against an anti-racist alliance that is demanding that all schools be responsive to the cultural forms of the parents and the community. That's what I mean by a non-reformist reforms. You wanted to interrupt the failure of Spanish-speaking children, but it opened the door to anti-racist mobilizations that had white parents and black parents and brown parents normally in intense competition for jobs, who would not trust each other. They wouldn't be in the same room with each other. They thought Donald Trump, oh God, I promised I would not mention his name. But instead, it was the lever to pry open a transformation of identities that now has an entire city moving towards anti-racist policies. Okay? So if I can use that example of here's the dream. We want something that binds us together, not pulls us apart. Race is very powerful as a discourse and a practice in my own nation. How do we interrupt racism? Practically, you start out by saying the school can do that because parents really believe that their kids are important. That's the best example of a non-reformist reform I can think of. Okay? Great question.
Thank you. Next question. In the back.
Rob, I'm student educational policies here. I think I have 3 questions.
Ask them one at a time.
So first one would be, so in an era where you have information available basically everywhere, everything is on the internet, and some people mistake that with knowledge. How do you make a case for a profession of a teacher if any iPhone, or that would be what the new hegemonic bloc would say, is smarter than any of the, if an iPhone can be smarter than any of the teacher that you can educate? What would be the case for that?
All right. This is complicated, and it's complicated because this is what I mean about that the world is contradictory. Things are yeses and nos. We now have a situation where the, neoliberalization of knowledge has meant first that knowledge, another key word here, is now more democratically gotten. Okay? That is a gain. So, for instance, I do not like the idea of strong states that are not willing to open themselves up to be taught by oppressed groups. Again, as I mentioned, I think that's an act of symbolic violence that worries me. So I think the answer to the loss of democracy is more democracy. Okay? That's in an ideal world. In the real world, this explosion of knowledge means that the very definition of knowledge itself has been transformed. It's anything that's available. So let me use the example of the Mr. Trump, my least favorite person perhaps in the world right now, who could be president of the United States. You think bombs are dropping on people now, wait till you see what happens next. Okay? And he's utterly racist. Right? It brings out some of the worst response from me. I become a real American. I want to get a gun. Okay? You forgive that, but I just think that he should be threatened back. But here we have someone who will say anything, and people will say, that's his narrative, that's fine. So the contradiction of the democratization of knowledge is also the commodification of knowledge, so that anything that will sell is now counted as epistemologically equal to anything else. So in my own nation, as an example, the idea that black people were brought to the United States as low-paid labor, and we had to civilize them, has the same credibility as we would have no nation unless we destroyed much of Africa. Okay? So there's the logic of equivalence. This is the paradox of my saying, this is the difficulty of the idea of autonomy of teachers that I was trying to respond to before, which is, how do you defend not just the right, but the discipline that teachers have of knowing things in a time when a teacher is is boring, even though it's illegal, half the students have their iPhones out and are checking stuff on Facebook or on the web, and that is much more interesting than anything a teacher will say no and do. So how do we then find, this is what I meant about it's partly an epistemological war. Given this logic of equivalence and the interest that goes with it, it destroys the idea of discipline, that actually to know things requires that you spend some time with it. It's not surface. And teachers do know things. At the same time as you want to sponsor, that there are many sites of knowledge that the state doesn't recognize, and that must be given legitimacy. That is the contradiction. So I think that historians actually here are trying to deal with this right now. So one of the most well-known people in this nation who's dealing with history is now engaged in a project, Darko, of trying to say, how can we restore particular kinds of legitimacy to historical knowledge using the media to do it? Now, that's a very interesting paradox, because the media is part of the problem as well as part of the solution. I'm engaged in what's called the Critical Media Project now, in which when there are rightist things, even things such as letters to the editor or what we call in English op-ed pieces, that is, pieces by right-wing think tanks or right-wing governments that are published in the newspaper as truth, we want to use the same media to speak back historically, to speak back empirically, to speak back politically and ethically. So one way of doing this, of dealing with this, is to have teachers and others use the same technologies to talk back and to recolonize and reoccupy that space. So I'll give one example of that. I do stuff on critical policy analysis and things like choice and vouchers and privatization. It's one of the areas I'm supposed to know a lot about. When a right-wing policy and right-wing piece of research comes out, the right sends an executive summary of that to every newspaper and television station in the entire nation. When it comes out, I am one of 150 scholars and community activists and pedagogues, right, who says, I will drop everything. I don't care what deadline I have. I have 4 days to write an eloquent and good response that will now be circulated on the media immediately. If it's even a letter to the editor on the opinion page. So in the U.S. and many nations, people will write attacking teachers or saying schools are bad places or pro-neoliberal stuff. I then have 1 day to write another letter to the editor to respond to it. So we who are progressives must learn how to use this media, again, to attack the people who are using this media to destroy what counts as knowledge. Now, this is difficult because even though I'm the former union organizer, I am not as good as the right in writing in plain folks Slovenian or plain folks English. I'm good at it, but I'm not as good. So what the right does, using the media as an example, is they have hired right-wing newspaper reporters who get paid, I'm not joking, $150,000 US a year. And their job is to take stuff from the right and translate it into plain folks English. This is why teachers are bad. We shouldn't trust them. If we could have them compete, if we could close down faculties of education because it's not real science. All of that is going on. We have discovered that we don't have $150,000. But what we do have at all of our universities are fellowships and scholarships and teaching assistantships. So at a number of universities in the United States right now, we have recruited critical journalists who are very good at the media. It's their job. They have to pay no fees, and in the United States, all universities, even public ones, you pay a lot of money to go to. So my own university at Wisconsin, it costs $15,000 a year just in fees. It doesn't count other expenses. So we have said half time, you'll do your PhD or your master's, and the other half, you'll take Michael Apple and rewrite my work. When I'm responding, you write it in good, popular English, and then it gets circulated. The right's hit rate, publication rate, is about 80%. We're at 37%. That's better than this number, 0, which is what it was before. So I want to think of this, as a space that the right has occupied, that could have been democratized in thick ways. It's now democratized in very thin ways as commodification and lies. So the way you fight it is to reoccupy the space. And I want to learn from the right about that. As I mentioned at the very beginning, the right says everything is important. We're so focused on the economy, which is crucial, obviously, that we forget that the right said everything was important. So let us reoccupy that space. It's there. Why aren't we occupying at the same time? To challenge the loss of facts. And I want teachers involved in this dramatically. Okay?
I just wanted to ask what's your opinion on MOOCs, considering the massive online open courses, considering that this was supposed to be the democratization of knowledge and education. And my third one is my attempt at the humor. Your perspective is Bernie or Hillary better for the US?
And the best line today comes from the back of the room. Okay. You won high PISA scores on that. That's good. Okay, so I don't know whether everyone heard the question. It's MOOCs. I am not a believer that this will solve many things. On the other hand, so that this again is, as I mentioned, I think the world is yes and no. The question is, what are the uses? Though there are certain logics to go with this. I think Habermas is not stupid, to say the very least, about the way in which purposive, rational, and technical logics colonize our very thought processes and colonize our identities. Okay? So I don't want to dismiss that at all. And those of you who know some of my early work, it was strongly influenced by what is formally called critical theory. Okay? MOOCs become a good example of these contradictions. So, here is the theory. The theory goes something like this. Universities are relatively elite spaces. We must not penalize people who did not have the class background to get there. We must democratize the knowledge. And by democratizing that knowledge, more people will have faith in themselves, be more robust participatory democracy as more people can participate. More people will see themselves as not irrational but rational. All of that will go on. And the university is a site where engineering knowledge, working class history, feminist theory, thermodynamics, great literature and popular literature can be democratized. And you can do that by some people paying fees to get a credential, and other people not getting a credential but getting a piece of paper that says they participated. And that is sort of the roots of this notion of sort of competency-based learning through performance can actually democratize schools and put pressure on schools to stop being more elitist than they should be. Okay? That's the theory. The closest thing we have to embodying that in a large scale was the Open University in England, which said for many, many, especially working class women who were seen as, child bearers and then child raisers, they had to have high status knowledge taught to them powerfully by some of the best people in the world, done in ways that it could be interrupted, that if a child is crying, you could pick it up later on, and we could democratize the knowledge because the way universities operate now is fully gendered. Okay? I have some sympathy with that argument because I do think, whether we like it or not, that's partly accurate about women doing two kinds of labor, paid and unpaid. Right? So men may help, but much of the domestic labor is still profoundly, and in many places even more, done by women. Okay? So it was supposed to be a democratizing space. Instead, that has been occupied by neoliberal and neoconservative forces. So let me give an example of what is happening. At the best universities in the United States, we have people at Wisconsin who are teaching courses with 30,000 people, of which there's 200 in the room, and 28,008, whatever. I was a math teacher too, and I just forgot how to do subtraction. Where the rest are sort of signed in, okay, as part of a conversion strategy. If they finish the course, they get a document. It's called a badge in the United States. And you can present that badge like in computer literacy, in coding, and you could be hired for half the salary of someone who has a degree in computer science, thereby saving Apple computers. I hoped that it was part of my family, but it's not. Rima and I went to the Apple store and said, look, we're willing to sell our souls to the devil if you can use us by saying the Apples use Apple computers, and they didn't even smile. I was hoping for a new iPad or something like that. But now Apple or Google will now hire people supposedly who don't have degrees because they sat in on a MOOC and they finished it, and you'll get hired in a good neoliberal agenda at half the salary of someone with a degree. Okay? It also has meant that people at lower status universities, we're beginning to see this pattern emerge in very destructive ways, don't have to hire people on the faculty in physics or chemistry or Slovenian literature or Chinese poetry or thermodynamics or computer science. It is much cheaper to purchase the license to use the MOOC. So what we're seeing now is low-paid academic proletarians who are then hired at what we call second-rank universities to run the discussion groups while Michael Apple will give his lecture on critical educational theory and society. So I become commodified, and my students get hired as part-time people whose office is the bus, going from university to university, teaching as the academic proletariat. That is my biggest worry about MOOCs right now in terms of what will happen at universities. It's the destruction of labor and the real transformation of what counts as teaching. Okay? I don't want to then say automatically that MOOCs are horrific. I'll give an example of this. I work with the Indigenous University of Mexico, and it draws half of its students who have fled the death squads from the Mexican government against indigenous people. So many of them are from Chiapas, where there is a war between the Zapatistas, the Liberation Army, and the government that is literally coming in and destroying people's lives, going in with guns. Okay? Because they want some autonomy in teaching in indigenous languages before the indigenous languages died. So they have established a university for indigenous people. It's called the Indigenous University of Mexico. It's in the western part of Mexico. And they have, this must stay in this room, partly illegally used all of one of their majors is computer science. MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, gives its classes in computer science for free as MOOCs. They don't ask for a license. And those are the courses that these poor indigenous students who have fled a war zone get, and they get a bachelor's degree in computer science from it. So these MOOCs, interestingly enough, can be partly counter-hegemonic, and I don't want to dismiss that. I want that to remain. But if the major implications are the destruction of university positions, the ways in which capital will now occupy that space by now paying much less, I want it stopped. Okay? So this is the paradox. It is contradictory. But it is not an answer to it is an answer to capital's questions. How do we save money on higher education? And they're damn good at answering that question. Okay? So, ideologically, I want Bernie Sanders to be president of the United States. I cannot take the risk of Donald Trump being president of the United States. I don't think Bernie Sanders can win. I don't think he can win. Donald Trump is the closest we have to fascism. Technically, in terms of the technical definition, he is a fascist except for one thing, and that is the vision of strong state. Okay? Other than that, he's a fascist. And he's a racist murderer. Okay? Even though his wife is from Slovenia, whose father, as I was just told, was a communist. I would like to tell the media about that part of it as well. Right? By the way, do you know that his father-in-law, anyway, but because of both personal and ideological kinds of things, as the parent of a black son, I personally cannot take the risk of a police state. Plus, I am very worried about one other thing, and that is, do we again skip a woman as president? It's as if, I hear many of my friends say, well, we've solved women's problems. Excuse me? Do you live in the real world? We're finally coming to understand that the state is fully patriarchal. It is a racial state, it is a class state, and it's a gendered state. Neoliberalism is a gendered form. It destroys the public sphere and turns it to the private sphere. And as I mentioned before, who does that labor for free now? It's women. It is a patriarchal state. And I think that we must not sacrifice that by and large, a politics of progressive whiteness, even though I agree totally with Sanders on almost everything. The fact that the black and brown communities and the majority of women's communities support Clinton, I have to be very cautious then about who's coming out of my mouth and what the implications are. So paradoxically, Rima and I will now not follow Bernie into saying you go to the convention and shut it down because progressives weren't listened to. Because personally, I'm amazed that I'm saying this, because anyone who knows my history knows that I will stand in the face of personal threat for the most progressive policies I can think of. But I don't think that the U.S. or Slovenia can take a risk of someone like Donald Trump being president. Because I think that the implications truly are more bombs, more bombers, the worst kind of rapacious neoliberal attacks, and an unethical government that will lie to the rest of the world constantly, and who treats women as objects to be tossed aside once he's had his pleasure. All right? That's my honest answer to your joke, but it also is one of anguish. I'm surprised in some ways that I would even say this, given my own history. But this is tough. This is really difficult, not just for me, but for anyone with my politics right now. All right?
That's like in this last answer of yours, I heard for the first time a word which originates from Europe and not from USA, like neoliberalism. And this is the word fascism. Is fascism actually the fifth umbrella? You didn't tell us that.
This is a really, I'm not surprised about when I opened my talk saying some of my teachers are in this room about these kinds of things, and you've just heard why I would say to Paula, again, you have become my teacher again, because I think that this is not just worthy of thinking about, I think it may be. And as someone whose grandparents came from Ukraine and from this region as well, and who had relatives who lived and came from Smyrna, Izmir, this is something that I've forgotten about the power, always, the underbelly of fascism that never disappears. So let me thank you for challenging me one more time. Oh shit, I've got to rewrite this book now. But it does show again how things are recursive. So we thought we could solve this by talking about the United States and England. Well, there are other agendas. Thank you.